Sometimes the cruelest moments in life become the doorway to our greatest blessings. Sometimes what others see as broken, God sees as perfectly whole. The people of Cedar Ridge thought they knew what they were doing when they brought Eleanor to the mountain man as a joke. This paralyzed young woman was their idea of cruel entertainment. They wanted to watch Grizzly McGraw turn her away. But Silas had learned something in those quiet mountains that the townspeople never understood. He could see past what was broken to find what was beautiful. Where they saw only limitations, he discovered strength and spirit that would change his life forever. What started as the town's mockery became a love story that proved true. Beauty lives in the heart, not the body. But could their bond survive when the wilderness tested everything they believed about love and survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Colorado Rockies like an old man's whiskers, gray and weathered from years of watching the world change below. In a cabin nestled between towering pines and granite cliffs, Silas McGraw stirred the coals of his stone fireplace, the same ritual he'd performed for 15 years of mountain solitude. At 42, Silas carried the kind of stillness that comes only from surviving war and choosing peace. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with nature's indifference, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared his simple breakfast. The hunting knife at his belt, his father's blade, worn smooth by 3 generations of McGraw men, caught the early light streaming through his single window. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, some 30 miles down the treacherous mountain path, had long ago stopped trying to understand Silas McGraw. To them, he was simply Grizzly, a mountain hermit who appeared in town twice yearly for supplies, paid in cash from his gold prospecting, and disappeared again into the wilderness like smoke. They whispered stories about his past, each tale growing taller with the telling. Some said he'd been a soldier who'd seen too much death. Others claimed he was hiding from the law. A few of the older folks remembered him differently. Remembered the young man who'd left Cedar Ridge 25 years ago with hope in his eyes and his sweetheart's promise to wait for his return. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew about Margaret. Silas paused in his morning routine, his weathered fingers tracing the carved initials on the cabin's main support beam. SM plus ML, 1855. Margaret Louise Hartwell had been everything bright and beautiful in his world. And when he'd enlisted to fight in the Mexican-American War, he'd carried her locket against his heart through every battle from Veracruz to Mexico City. He'd returned to find her grave barely a year old. Consumption, they'd told him. She'd waited as long as she could. That was when Silas had taken his father's hunting knife, his grief, and what remained of his faith, and disappeared into the mountains. The war had taught him how to kill, but the mountains had taught him how to live. Simply, quietly, without the complications that seemed to drive other men to madness. His cabin reflected this philosophy. Built with his own hands from local timber and mountain stone, it was sturdy and functional rather than comfortable. A single room served as bedroom, kitchen, and sitting area, with a small lean-to addition that housed his workshop. The furniture was sparse: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books salvaged from his childhood home. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. But this morning felt different. Restless energy coursed through him as he sipped his coffee and watched the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold. Perhaps it was the changing season. Autumn had settled into the high country with its crisp promise of winters, challenges ahead. Or perhaps it was the dream that had visited him 3 nights running, the one where Margaret stood in his doorway, not as the young woman he'd lost, but aged into the grace she'd never had the chance to achieve. In the dream, she'd spoken words that made no sense upon waking. "She's coming, Silas. She needs what you have to give." He set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. Dreams were for younger men with softer hearts. He had reality to attend to. Wood to split, meat to smoke, preparations to make for the hard months ahead. 30 miles away in the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Eleanor Whitmore sat in her crude wooden wheelchair, trying to ignore the whispered conversations and pointed stares that followed her wherever she went. At 26, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that belonged in drawing rooms and ballrooms, not in a frontier town where survival trumped sophistication. Her dark hair was always perfectly arranged despite her circumstances, her green eyes sharp with intelligence that most people overlooked in favor of pitying her paralyzed legs. The accident that had claimed the use of her legs had happened 3 years ago, when the stagecoach carrying her family from Chicago to their new life in California had hit a washout during a mountain storm. Eleanor remembered every detail with crystalline clarity, the screaming of horses, the splintering of wood, the moment she'd realized she couldn't feel her legs beneath the wreckage. Her parents had died instantly. She'd survived with a broken back and a trust fund that was rapidly dwindling under the care of distant relatives who saw her as nothing more than an expensive burden. Now she lived in the charity of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, her inheritance almost gone, her options narrowing with each passing day. The townspeople were kind enough in their way, but their kindness came wrapped in pity that chafed worse than any physical pain. They spoke to her in the gentle tones reserved for children and simpletons, never quite meeting her eyes, always eager to move past the discomfort her presence seemed to create. Eleanor had been educated by private tutors in Chicago, fluent in 3 languages, accomplished in mathematics and literature. She'd once dreamed of teaching, perhaps even writing, but in Cedar Ridge she was simply the poor, crippled girl, a reminder of life's cruelties that made people uncomfortable in their own good fortune. What the townspeople didn't know was that Eleanor had overheard enough conversations to understand her precarious position. Mrs. Henderson's charity was wearing thin, and there was talk among the town council about what to do with her. Some suggested sending her to a sanitarium back east. Others whispered about the territorial poorhouse where the unfortunate were warehoused until death claimed them. It was Jeremiah Polk, the town's most prominent merchant and self-appointed moral authority, who'd first suggested the joke. Eleanor had been sitting in her wheelchair outside the general store when she'd overheard him talking to a group of men about the mountain man, Grizzly McGraw. Polk had said with a mean-spirited chuckle. Been alone up there so long, probably. Forgotten what a woman looks like. Bet he'd take anything female at this point, even a broken one. The other men had laughed, and Eleanor had felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. But she'd listened as the idea took shape. A cruel prank that would supposedly solve 2 problems at once. They'd present her to the mountain man as if she were a prize, expecting him to reject her in disgust, providing entertainment for the town, and perhaps shocking Eleanor into accepting whatever charity arrangement they ultimately decided upon. Eleanor knew she should be horrified by the plan, should fight against being used as the punchline of their joke. But the truth was, she was tired, bone-deep tired of being pitied, of being a burden, of watching her life slip away one uncomfortable conversation at a time. If this mountain man was as wild and uncivilized as they claimed, at least his rejection, it would be honest. At least she'd know where she stood. And if by some miracle he didn't reject her immediately, well, anything had to be better than slowly suffocating on the kindness of people who wished she'd just disappear. The plan was set for Saturday afternoon, when the mountain man was due for his seasonal trip to town. Polk had spread word through Cedar Ridge that there would be entertainment in the town square, though he'd been coy about the details. Eleanor had said nothing when Mrs. Henderson had fussed over her appearance that morning, braiding her hair with extra care and insisting she wear her best dress, a blue silk that had survived from her former life and made her eyes shine like emeralds. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Henderson had said, though her smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. Just lovely. Eleanor had smiled and nodded, playing her part in the charade. But inside, she was preparing for whatever came next. She'd survived. The loss of her parents, the destruction of her body, the slow erosion of her dignity. She could survive this too. What she didn't expect, what none of them expected, was that Silas McGraw had spent 15 years in the mountains learning to see past surfaces, to find the essential truth of things. The war had taught him about men's capacity for both cruelty and nobility. The mountains had taught him about strength that didn't show on the outside, and Margaret's memory had taught him something even more precious, that love wasn't about perfection. It was about seeing clearly, accepting completely, and choosing to stay when staying was difficult. The hunting knife at his belt had been witness to his father's courtship of his mother, a woman whose own struggles had made her stronger rather than weaker. The blade carried the memory of 3 generations of McGraw men who'd learned that true worth wasn't measured by the world's standards. As Saturday afternoon approached, neither Eleanor nor Silas could have predicted that a town's cruel joke was about to become something altogether different. But then again, the mountains had always been a place where unexpected things took root and grew into something beautiful, given enough time and the right conditions. The stage was set, the players were in position, and somewhere in the thin mountain, air change was stirring like the first whisper of an avalanche, quiet at first, but carrying the power to reshape everything in its path. Saturday afternoon descended on Cedar Ridge with the weight of expectation. The town square buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation that reminded Eleanor of the moments before a thunderstorm, electric, charged with the promise of something momentous about to unfold. From her position near the general store, Eleanor watched the townspeople gather in loose clusters, their conversations animated but hushed. Children darted between the adults, sensing excitement without understanding its source. The older women had positioned themselves on the wooden sidewalk in front of the millinery shop, their faces wearing expressions of practiced disapproval that barely concealed their curiosity. In her lap, Eleanor clutched a faded letter, the last correspondence she'd received from her mother, written just days before the accident that had changed everything. The paper was soft with handling, the ink slightly smeared from tears, both old and new. Her mother's elegant script spoke of love, of strength, of the importance of seeing goodness in unexpected places. Eleanor had read those words so many times. She could recite them from memory, but today they felt like armor against what was coming. "There he is," someone whispered, and the murmur spread through the crowd like ripples on water. Silas McGraw emerged from the narrow path that led up from the mountains, leading a sturdy pack mule laden with furs and the small leather pouches that contained his seasonal gold dust. Even at a distance, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid confidence of a man equally at home on a battlefield or a mountain trail. His beard was fuller than it had been during his last visit, streaked with silver that caught the afternoon light. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, worn leather pants, a homespun shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles of rocky terrain. Eleanor found herself studying him more carefully than she'd expected. The townspeople's stories had painted him as something between a wild animal and a fairy tale monster, but the man approaching showed none of the crude barbarism she'd been led to expect. His movements were deliberate, economical, suggesting discipline rather than wildness. When he paused to speak to old Henrik the blacksmith, his posture was respectful, attentive. "Afternoon, Mr. McGraw," Henrik called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Good season in the mountains?" "Good." "Enough," Silas replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of relying on one's own judgment. "Winter's coming early this year. Can smell it in the air." Eleanor noticed that several people had begun to drift closer, forming a loose semicircle around the mountain man and his mule. Jeremiah Polk stood at the edge of the group, his face wearing an expression of barely contained glee. He caught Eleanor's eye across the square and nodded, a signal that their charade was about to begin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Part of her wanted to wheel her chair away, to escape before she became the centerpiece of their entertainment. But another part, the part that had been shaped by loss and hardship into something harder than the soft Chicago socialite she'd once been, held her ground. If she was going to be humiliated, she'd face it with dignity. "Mr. McGraw," Polk called out, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the square. "Might we have a word with you? The town has something of a proposition." Silas turned toward Polk, his grey eyes taking in the assembled crowd with the kind of careful assessment Eleanor imagined he used when evaluating potential threats in the wilderness. Something in his expression shifted. Not fear, but a subtle wariness that suggested he'd recognized the setup for what it was. "What kind of proposition?" he asked, his voice neutral. Polk stepped forward, playing to his audience with practiced ease. "Well, now we've been talking among ourselves about your situation up there in the mountains. Fine country, no doubt, but awful lonely for a man on his own. Seems to us you might benefit from some feminine companionship." A few people chuckled at this, though the laughter had a nervous edge. Eleanor noticed that not everyone in the crowd seemed comfortable with what was unfolding. Mrs. Garrison, the preacher's wife, had pressed her lips into a thin line of disapproval. Young Tom Bradley looked actively distressed. Silas said nothing, waiting. "Now we know you're particular," Polk continued, warming to his performance. "You can't expect a man like yourself to settle for just anyone. That's why we've taken the liberty of finding someone special, someone who might appreciate the peace and quiet of mountain life." He gestured grandly toward Eleanor, and suddenly every eye in the square was fixed on her. The silence stretched like a held breath. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares, the mixture of pity and cruel anticipation that she'd learned to recognize in the months since her accident. But she kept her chin up, her hands folded calmly in, her lap around her mother's letter. If they expected her to crumble, they would be disappointed. Silas followed Polk's gesture, his gaze finding Eleanor across the crowded square. She expected to see the quick flicker of disgust or disappointment that usually crossed people's faces when they looked at her, the momentary recognition of her limitations before they arranged their features into masks of polite sympathy. Instead, she saw something entirely unexpected. His eyes met hers directly, without flinching or sliding away. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment. He looked at her the way she remembered being looked at before the accident, as a person first, complete and worthy of consideration. The moment stretched between them, separate from the crowd's expectations and the cruel joke they were trying to orchestrate. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and resignation that had taken up residence there. Silas began walking toward her, his boots echoing on the wooden planks of the sidewalk. The crowd parted to let him pass, their anticipation almost palpable. Polk was grinning now, certain that his entertainment was about to reach its climax. When Silas reached Eleanor's chair, he stopped and looked down at her, not the way people usually looked down at her, with condescension or discomfort, but the way a man might look at an equal he was meeting for the first time. Up close, she could see that his grey eyes held depths of experience that the townspeople had never bothered to recognize. There were lines around them that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain distances, but also of laughter and sorrow, and the kind of wisdom that comes only from genuine living. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "I'm Silas McGraw." Eleanor felt her prepared responses dissolve. She'd been ready for mockery, for rejection, for the kind of cruel laughter that would give the town its entertainment and confirm her worst fears about her own worth. She hadn't been prepared for simple respect. "Eleanor Whitmore," she managed, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Miss Eleanor," he said, and the way he spoke her name was like hearing it for the first time. "I wonder if I might ask you a question." The crowd was growing restless. This wasn't going according to their script. Polk stepped forward, perhaps sensing that his joke was slipping away from him. "Now, Mr. McGraw, you don't need to—" Silas held up one hand without taking his eyes off Eleanor. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it carried enough quiet authority to stop Polk mid-sentence. "The question's for the lady," Silas said firmly. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you want to be here?" he asked simply. The directness of it caught her off guard. Not, "Are you willing to come with me?" or "Do you think you could manage mountain life?" Just the essential question that cut through all the artifice and manipulation. Did she want to be part of this moment? Or was she being used against her will? Around them, the crowd stirred uneasily. This conversation wasn't following the path they'd expected. The cruel joke was transforming into something else entirely, something that made them uncomfortable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Eleanor looked at Silas McGraw, this mountain man who'd been presented to her as a savage, but who'd shown her more genuine courtesy in 2 minutes than she'd received from the civilized townspeople in months. She thought of her mother's letter, in her lap, of the words about finding goodness in unexpected places. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'd like the choice to find out." Something shifted in Silas's expression, a small smile that transformed his weathered features and made her understand why Margaret Louise Hartwell might have waited for him through a war. "Then the choice is yours," he said. "My cabin's got room for 2, if you're inclined to see what the mountains have to offer. No obligation beyond that." The crowd was murmuring now, sensing that their entertainment had escaped their control entirely. Polk's face had gone red with frustration and embarrassment. "Now see here," he began. "I believe," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength, "that Mr. McGraw was addressing me." She looked up at Silas, this unexpected man who'd somehow seen past her broken body to something worth considering. "I accept your invitation, Mr. McGraw, with gratitude." Silas nodded once, then turned to survey the crowd with an expression that had gone considerably cooler. "I'll be needing to borrow a wagon," he said, "and I'll pay fair price for it." The easier, practical matter of transportation seemed to snap people back to reality. Henrik stepped forward, nodding toward a sturdy farm wagon hitched to 2 patient horses. "Take mine, Silas, no charge." As Silas lifted Eleanor from her wheelchair with surprising gentleness, settling her carefully on the wagon's bench seat, the crowd began to disperse. Their joke had become something else entirely, something that left them feeling oddly diminished rather than entertained. Jeremiah Polk stood watching as Silas secured Eleanor's few possessions in the wagon bed alongside. His own supplies. The mountain man's movements were efficient, considerate, treating her belongings with the same care he'd show his own. "This wasn't what we intended," Polk said, though his voice lacked conviction. Silas straightened, fixing the merchant with a steady stare. "No," he agreed quietly, "I don't reckon it was." As the wagon rolled away from Cedar Ridge toward the mountain path, Eleanor clutched her mother's letter and tried to process what had just happened. She was leaving everything familiar, traveling with the man she'd met 10 minutes ago, toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't being carried along by other people's plans for her. She'd made a choice, a real choice, and whatever came next would be hers to face. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast indifference of the mountains. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and the possibility of something entirely unexpected. The joke was over. The real story was just beginning. The wagon climbed steadily into the mountains, following a path that seemed to exist more in Silas's memory than in any visible markers. On the rocky terrain, Eleanor gripped the bench seat as the wheels found purchase on slopes that would have terrified her in her previous life. But something about Silas's quiet confidence in handling the horses made her feel safer than she'd felt in months. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people are content to let the moment speak for itself. Around them, the mountains revealed their autumn glory in shades of gold and crimson that no Chicago ballroom had ever attempted to match. The air grew thinner and cleaner with each mile, carrying scents of pine and wood smoke that seemed to wash away the dust and disappointment of Cedar Ridge. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said finally, the first words either of them had spoken since leaving town. "Gets more so the higher you go," Silas replied. "Like most things worth having, the mountains make you work for their best secrets." They passed a small clearing where a creek tumbled down from higher elevations, the water so clear Eleanor could see the smooth stones on the bottom. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down without explanation, returning with a tin cup filled with mountain water. "Try it," he said, offering her the cup. The water was cold enough to make her teeth ache, but it tasted like nothing she'd ever experienced, pure and bright, as if it had been filtered through starlight. She found herself draining the entire cup before handing it back to him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than just the water. As they continued climbing, Eleanor found herself studying her unexpected companion. His hands on the reins were competent without being showy, and he spoke to the horses in low tones that suggested years of partnership rather than mere ownership. When the path narrowed dangerously, he didn't tense or hurry. He simply adjusted their pace and trusted in his own experience. "Mr. McGraw," she said as they navigated a particularly steep section, "may I ask you something?" "Silas," he corrected gently, "and ask whatever you're inclined to ask. Why did you do it? Back there in town, I mean. You could have walked away." And from their joke, should have, probably. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, 15 years ago, I learned that cruel people see what they expect to see. But I also learned that if you look past what's broken, sometimes you find something stronger than what was there before." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "And what if what's broken can't be fixed?" "Then maybe it wasn't broken," Silas said simply. "Maybe it was just changed into something different, something that serves a different purpose than what came before." The cabin appeared around a bend in the path like something from a fairy tale, not because it was elaborate or beautiful in any conventional sense, but because it looked so perfectly suited to its surroundings. Built from local timber and fieldstone, it seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and the windows glowed with warm lamplight that spoke of home in ways Eleanor had almost forgotten. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as Silas helped her down from the wagon. 15 years come spring," he said, lifting her with the same care he might handle precious cargo. "Built every inch of it myself." The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, everything arranged with military precision. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable chairs positioned to take advantage of both its warmth and the view through the main window. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that surprised Eleanor, volumes of poetry alongside practical guides to mining and wilderness survival, works of philosophy next to detailed botanical studies. "You read," she observed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Every day," Silas confirmed, settling her into one of the chairs by the fire. "Books are about the only thing worth hauling up a mountain that don't weigh too much or spoil in the weather." He moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire and putting water on to boil, but Eleanor noticed the subtle changes he made, shifting a small table closer to her chair, moving a lamp where she could reach it easily. Nothing dramatic, nothing that called attention to itself, but each adjustment made the space more accessible for her. That first evening, they ate a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, while Eleanor tried to process the magnitude of what she'd done. She was alone in the mountains with a man she barely knew, dependent on his goodwill for everything from shelter to safety. By any reasonable measure, she should be terrified. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: possibility. "The town will be talking about today for months," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Let them talk," Silas replied, carving thin shavings from a block of wood with movements that were almost meditative. "Words don't change what is." Eleanor watched his hands shape the wood, noting the patience and precision in each cut. "What are you making?" "Bowls," he said without looking up. "Figured you might like your own dishes. Man living alone doesn't need much, but two people ought to have proper table settings." The casual assumption that she would be staying, that this was now their shared space rather than his solitary domain, moved her more than any grand gesture could have. He wasn't asking permission or seeking gratitude. He was simply adapting to new circumstances with the same practical efficiency he brought to everything else. "I should warn you," Eleanor said. "I'm not much use for typical women's work. Can't exactly chase chickens or tend a garden from a wheelchair." Silas looked up from his carving, his grey eyes holding that direct honesty she was beginning to recognize as his hallmark. "Good thing I don't keep chickens, then. And the garden's mostly wild herbs and such, grows itself for the most part." "Then what exactly do you expect from me?" "Nothing more than what you're inclined to give," he said simply, "though I suspect you're more capable than you think. Different doesn't mean useless, just means finding new ways to do things." That night Silas insisted she take the bed while he made do with blankets by the fire. Eleanor protested, but he'd simply shaken his head. "Mountain hospitality," he'd said in a tone that brooked no argument. "Guest gets the bed. That's how it works." Lying in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the subtle settling of the cabin's timbers, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since before the accident. She felt like herself again, not the broken thing that needed managing or the burden that required constant accommodation. Silas McGraw had looked at her and seen a person worth considering, worth making room for, worth taking a chance on. It was such a simple thing, but it was everything. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Silas moving quietly around the cabin. Through the window, she could see him splitting wood with an axe that moved in perfect rhythm, each stroke placed with the kind of precision that spoke of years of practice. When he came inside, his hair damp with sweat despite the cool morning air, he found her sitting up in bed, fully awake and watching him with curious eyes. "Morning," he said, hanging his axe by the door. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Eleanor admitted. "The quiet up here, it's different from town. Quiet, peaceful rather than empty." "Mountains have their own conversation," Silas agreed, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Takes a while to learn the language, but once you do, you never feel lonely." He brought her coffee and helped her into her chair, again with that matter-of-fact gentleness that never made her feel fragile or helpless. Over breakfast, they began to talk about practical matters, where she might be most comfortable in the cabin, what she might need that he didn't currently have, how they might adapt his routines to accommodate 2 people instead of 1. "I can read and write," Eleanor offered, "and I'm fair with numbers. If you have correspondence or accounts to keep, might be helpful," Silas acknowledged. "Mining claims require paperwork sometimes, and my handwriting's nothing to boast about." It was a small thing, but it gave Eleanor a sense of purpose she'd been missing. She wasn't just being sheltered out of charity, she had something to contribute, a way to earn her place in this unexpected partnership. As the days passed, they fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness. Silas would rise before dawn to tend his traplines and check his mining claims, returning by midday with stories of what he'd seen: eagles riding the thermals, a family of deer picking their way delicately through fresh snow, the subtle changes. In the mountains that spoke of coming weather, Eleanor, meanwhile, discovered that the cabin's single large room could accommodate her chair better than she'd expected. The wooden floors were smooth and level, and Silas had quietly made adjustments, widening doorways, lowering shelves, creating clear paths between furniture that made navigation easier without calling attention to the changes. She began organizing his books, creating a simple library system that made it easier to find specific volumes. She took over the task of keeping accounts, documenting his mining yields and trading activities with a precision that impressed him. And in the evenings, by the light of the fire, she would read aloud while he worked on various projects, carving bowls, mending equipment, crafting the small improvements that made mountain life more comfortable. "You have a fine voice for reading," Silas told her one evening as she finished a chapter from a book of Emerson's essays. "Been a long time since I've heard poetry read properly." Eleanor felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It had, and been a long time since anyone had complimented her on anything beyond her courage in the face of adversity, as if courage were her only remaining virtue. "My mother insisted on proper elocution," she said a lady should be able to hold a room's attention whether she was reading scripture or reciting Shakespeare. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the faded letter she kept in her skirt pocket. She was. She used to say that God never closes a door without opening a window, but sometimes we're so busy mourning the door that we miss the window entirely. Silas looked up from the piece of leather he was working, his grey eyes thoughtful. Reckoned she might have been right about that? As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, Eleanor began to understand why Silas had chosen this life. The mountains demanded honesty, from the weather, from the wildlife, from the people who chose to make their home in such unforgiving beauty. There was no room for pretense or false courtesy up here. Things were what they were, and you dealt with them accordingly. It was a harsh kind of truth, but it was also liberating. For the first time since her accident, Eleanor wasn't being managed, or handled or treated like a problem to be solved. She was simply Eleanor, sharing space and responsibilities with Silas, contributing what she could, and learning to adapt to what she couldn't change. The carved wooden bowls were finished on a cold October morning when the first serious snow dusted the peaks above them. Silas presented them to her with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he brought to everything else. "Now we're properly set up for two," he said, setting her bowl beside his at the simple wooden table. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the subtle variations that spoke of handcraft rather than manufacture. It was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly proportioned and finished with care. But more than that, it was hers, made specifically for her in recognition of her place in this shared life they were building. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than such simple syllables should have been able to bear. Silas nodded, understanding without explanation the significance of the moment. Two people, two bowls, two places at the table. They had become a household, a partnership, something more substantial than either charity or convenience. Outside, winter was gathering its strength for the long siege ahead. But inside the cabin, warmth and light and the beginning of something precious were taking root, growing strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing the first real snowfall that transformed the mountains into a crystalline wonderland. Eleanor woke to a world made new. Every tree branch outlined in white, every surface softened into curves that spoke of winter's gentle artistry. But beneath the beauty lay a reminder of the mountains' power. They were now truly isolated, cut off from the outside world until spring's thaw reopened the lower passes. "Storms moving in from the northwest," Silas observed over breakfast, studying the sky through the cabin's main window. "Could be a big one. We'll want to make sure we're well prepared." Eleanor had learned to read the subtle signs he watched. The way the wind shifted direction, the peculiar quality of light that preceded major weather, the behavior of the wildlife that served as nature's early warning system. Living in the mountains meant paying attention to such things, and she found herself developing an appreciation for knowledge that couldn't be found in any book. "What do we need to do?" she asked, automatically including herself in the preparations. Silas smiled at the "we," a small expression that transformed his weathered features and made her understand why he'd once inspired a young woman to wait through a war. "Mostly it's already done. But I could use help organizing the food stores, making sure everything's accessible if the snow gets deep enough to make moving around difficult." They spent the morning working together, Eleanor cataloging supplies while Silas rearranged storage to ensure essentials were within easy reach. She discovered he was remarkably well prepared for isolation, not just the basics of flour and preserved meat, but luxuries that spoke of a man who understood the importance of comfort during long, dark months. "Tea," she said, examining a collection of carefully wrapped packages. "And real coffee beans, not just the ground powder from town. You live well up here, Silas McGraw." "A man can go without many things," he replied, adjusting the position of a heavy barrel to make it more accessible. "But good coffee and something pleasant to drink in the evenings, those aren't luxuries. Those are necessities for keeping your spirits up when the world turns white and stays that way for months." Among his supplies, Eleanor found something that made her catch her breath. A wooden flute, carved from what looked like cherry wood, polished smooth by handling but obviously unused for some time. When she held it up questioningly, Silas paused in his work, his expression growing distant. "Made that the second winter I was up here," he said quietly. "Thought music might help pass the long evenings. Never could bring myself to play it, though." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment, then shrugged with the kind of casual gesture that didn't fool her for a second. "Some things remind you too much of what you've lost. Music was something Margaret and I shared." Eleanor turned the flute over in her hands, feeling the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Every fingerhole was precisely placed, the wood sanded to silk smoothness. It was the work of a man who understood both the theory and the practice of making music. "You know how to play," she observed. "Used to. My father taught me when I was a boy, said a man ought to be able to make beauty as well as useful things." Silas returned to organizing supplies, but Eleanor could sense the memories stirring. "Margaret loved hearing me play. Said it was like having a little piece of heaven right there in the parlor." Eleanor set the flute carefully aside, but she noticed Silas glancing at it occasionally as they continued their work. An idea was taking shape in her mind, but she kept it to herself for now. That afternoon, as the promised storm began to gather force, they retreated to the warmth of the cabin and settled into what was becoming their routine. Eleanor reading aloud while Silas worked on various projects. But today, instead of reaching for one of his books, she pulled out a small journal from her possessions. "I've been thinking," she said, "about starting a record of our time here. The daily life, the seasons, the way the mountains change. Would you mind if I read some of what I've written?" Silas looked up from the leather harness he was mending, his expression curious. "I'd like that." Eleanor opened the journal, finding the entry she wanted. November 15th, 1870. "The mountains wear winter like a queen wears velvet, with casual majesty that makes you forget there was ever any other way for them to look. Silas says the big snows are coming, but I find I'm not afraid. There's something about this place that makes you trust in the fundamental rightness of things, even when those things are beyond your control." She glanced up to find Silas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You write well," he said simply. "Got a way with words that makes me see things fresh. I used to write letters for neighbors back in Chicago," Eleanor said, closing the journal. "People who couldn't write for themselves. My mother said everyone has stories worth telling, but not everyone has the words to tell them properly. Reckon your mother was right about that too." Outside, the wind began to howl with increasing intensity, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending snow spiraling past the windows in hypnotic patterns. But inside, warmth and light created a sanctuary that felt removed from the storm's fury. "Silas," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a note of gentle determination, "would you play something for me?" He looked up sharply, his hands stilling on his work. "Eleanor, not for Margaret," she said quickly. "For me, for now. Music doesn't belong to the past unless we leave it there." She reached for the wooden flute, holding it out to him with steady hands. "I think 15 years is long enough to let something beautiful stay silent." For a moment, she thought he might refuse. His grey eyes held the kind of pain that comes from associations too deep to easily overcome. But then he set aside his work and took the flute from her hands, his fingers finding their positions with muscle memory that hadn't forgotten despite the years of disuse. The first notes were tentative, rusty from disuse, but true in pitch. Then, as his confidence returned, the melody began to flow with increasing richness. It was a simple tune, nothing elaborate or showy, but it filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, afraid to break the spell. This was Silas as she'd never seen him, not the practical mountain man or the careful protector, but the young man who'd once played music for a sweetheart and believed in beauty for its own sake. When the song ended, silence settled between them, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, deeper, more complete. Something had shifted in the air between them, a recognition of trust given and received. "That was beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "Been a long time since I made music for anyone," Silas replied, his voice rougher than usual. "Too long," Eleanor said firmly. "Some gifts aren't meant to stay buried, too." Over the following days, as the storm raged outside and they settled into the enforced intimacy of shared isolation, music became part of their evening routine. Silas would play, sometimes melodies from his youth, sometimes new tunes he created, from the sounds of wind and weather around them. Eleanor would listen and occasionally hum along, her voice blending with the flute's clear tones in harmonies that seemed to happen naturally. But it was during these evening concerts that Eleanor began to truly understand the man she was sharing her life with. In his choice of melodies, in the way he played sad songs with hope threading through them and happy songs with an underlying note of poignancy. She heard the story of someone who'd experienced profound loss, but hadn't let it destroy his capacity for beauty. "You know," she said one evening as snow continued to pile against the windows, "I never expected to find such culture in the wilderness." Silas lowered the flute, smiling at her words. "Mountains don't make a man crude unless he chooses to be crude. Solitude can coarsen you, or it can refine you down to what's essential. I decided a long time ago I wanted to be the kind of man who could appreciate beauty when he found it." "And have you found beauty up here, I mean?" He looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes holding an expression that made her pulse quicken. "More than I expected," he said quietly, "especially lately." The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it reached the cabin's windowsills. But inside, something equally transformative had been happening. The careful courtesy that had marked their early interactions was giving way to something warmer, more natural. They moved around each other with increasing ease, their conversations flowing with the kind of rhythm that comes when two people begin to truly know each other. Eleanor found herself studying Silas when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way his hands moved with unconscious grace, whether he was carving, playing music, or simply preparing their meals. There was artistry in everything he did, an attention to craft and beauty that spoke of a soul that had never truly been tamed by circumstance. And sometimes she caught him watching her in return, his expression holding something that made her remember she was still a woman, despite everything that had happened to her. One morning, as she worked at organizing his correspondence and accounts, Eleanor discovered something that made her pause. A stack of letters, addressed in feminine handwriting, tied with a faded ribbon. They were postmarked from years past, and the return address was simply MLH, Cedar Ridge. Margaret's letters. The correspondence from his lost love, kept all these years. Eleanor stared at the bundle, torn between curiosity and respect for his privacy. These letters represented the deepest part of his past, the love that had shaped his retreat into the mountains. She was reaching to put them back where she'd found them when Silas's voice stopped her. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You can read them if you want. Might help you understand some things." Eleanor turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression calm but watchful. "I wasn't trying to pry." "I know." He moved into the cabin, hanging up his coat and settling into his chair by the fire. "But we're sharing a life now, Eleanor. The past is part of that, whether we talk about it or not." Eleanor untied the ribbon with careful fingers, opening the first letter. Margaret's handwriting was elegant, educated, the script of a young woman who'd been well taught. The words spoke of love and longing, of a woman waiting faithfully while her beloved fought in a distant war. "My dearest Silas," the first letter began, "I count the days until your return like a miser counts gold. The apple tree by my window has begun to bloom, and I remember how you said we'd sit beneath it when you came home, planning the life we'd build together." Eleanor read several letters in silence, aware of Silas watching her from across the room. Margaret wrote of daily life in Cedar Ridge, of her work teaching school, of her dreams for their future. But as the letters progressed, a subtle change crept in. Mentions of a persistent cough, of feeling tired, of winter's unusual harshness. The final letter was dated just 3 months before Silas's return. Margaret's handwriting had grown shakier, the words fewer. "I'm trying to hold on, my love," she'd written. "But if I cannot, please know that loving you has been the greatest joy of my life. Don't let grief make you forget how to live." Eleanor folded the letters carefully, retying the ribbon with hands that trembled slightly. The depth of love contained in those pages, the tragedy of timing that had stolen Silas's chance at happiness. It explained so much about the man he'd become. "She was remarkable," Eleanor said softly. "She was," Silas agreed. "But she's been gone 24 years, Eleanor. I've carried that grief long enough to know it doesn't have to define the rest of my life." Their eyes met across the cabin, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. Not the erasure of the past, but an acknowledgement that the present held its own possibilities. "She would have wanted you to be happy," Eleanor said. "I think she would have," Silas replied. "And I think she would have liked you. You have some of the same qualities, strength that doesn't announce itself, kindness that comes naturally rather than from duty." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. To be compared favorably to the woman he'd loved so deeply felt like the highest compliment she could receive. That evening, as the fire burned low and snow whispered against the windows, Silas played a melody Eleanor hadn't heard before, something original, created from the peace and contentment of their shared space. When he finished, he set the flute aside and looked at her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. What happened in town, the way they brought you to me, I'll always be grateful for it, even though their intentions were cruel. Some gifts come wrapped in ugly paper." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I never expected to find happiness again," she admitted. "After the accident, I thought that part of my life was over." "Maybe the life you planned was over," Silas said gently, "but that doesn't mean life itself has to end. Sometimes the path we don't choose turns out to be the one we needed to walk." Outside, winter continued its reign over the mountains, but inside the cabin, warmth and music and the beginning of something precious were taking root. The wooden flute, silent for so many years, had found its voice again. And in finding it, both Eleanor and Silas were discovering that some gifts, whether of music, companionship, or unexpected love, were too valuable to remain buried in the past. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day in Cedar Ridge. She was no longer the broken woman the townspeople had offered as a joke. nor was Silas the wild hermit they'd imagined him to be. They were becoming something new together, partners, companions, and perhaps something even deeper. The mountain winter stretched ahead of them, long and challenging, but Eleanor found herself looking forward to it rather than fearing it. Whatever storms might come, they would face them together, with music and warmth and the growing certainty that some of life's greatest blessings come disguised as ordinary moments shared between two people who have learned to see each other clearly. December brought the kind of cold that reminded you the mountains could kill the careless or unprepared. The thermometer Silas kept by the cabin door read 20 below zero on the morning when their quiet routine was shattered by the sound that no mountain dweller ever wanted to hear, the hunting howl of wolves, far too close for comfort. Eleanor woke to find Silas already up, standing perfectly still by the window with his rifle in his hands. His posture carried the kind of alert tension she'd never seen in him before, the bearing of a soldier who'd learned to distinguish between ordinary danger and the kind that could end everything. "What is it?" she asked quietly, not wanting to startle him. "Wolf pack," he said without turning from the window. "Big one from the sound of it, and they're hunting something that's brought them down from the high country." Eleanor maneuvered her chair to where she could see out the window, her heart hammering as she caught sight of grey shapes moving through the trees like living shadows. There had to be at least 6 of them, maybe more, their winter coats thick, and their movements coordinated with the kind of intelligence that made wolves the apex predators of the mountain wilderness. "Are we safe in here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Safe enough," Silas replied, but his grip on the rifle never relaxed. "Cabin's solid, and wolves generally don't bother with humans unless they're desperate or cornered, but something's got them stirred up." The answer came in the form of a sound that made Eleanor's blood freeze, the terrified bleating of an animal in mortal danger. Through the trees, she could see a flash of movement, something large and dark, crashing through the underbrush with "The pack in pursuit, elk," Silas said grimly. "Young bull from the look of it, probably injured or sick, or the wolves wouldn't have risked coming this low." The chase was brief and brutal. Eleanor turned away from the window as the wolves brought down their prey, but she could hear the sounds of the kill, the snarls and snaps of predators claiming their meal. When she finally looked again, the wolves were feeding, their muzzles dark with blood against the pristine snow. "Nature's way," Silas said, though his voice carried no satisfaction. "Not pretty to watch, but necessary. Wolves take the weak and the sick, keep the herd strong." Eleanor nodded, understanding the logic even as her city-bred sensibilities recoiled. From the violence, this was the reality of mountain life, beautiful and harsh in equal measure, governed by laws that had nothing to do with human comfort or sentiment. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that the wolves weren't planning to move on anytime soon. They'd claimed the area around their kill as temporary territory, and that territory included the approaches to Silas's cabin. When he tried to venture out to check his trap lines, the pack's alpha, a massive grey male with intelligent yellow eyes, positioned himself between Silas and the forest, making his intentions clear without need for dramatic gestures. "Looks like we're staying put for a while," Silas said, settling back into the cabin with philosophical acceptance. "Pack'll move on once they've finished with the elk, but that could take days." Eleanor found herself studying him as he adapted to their enforced confinement. There was no frustration or impatience in his manner, just the calm acceptance of someone who'd learned to work with nature rather than against it. It was a quality she was beginning to recognize as fundamental to his character, this ability to flow with circumstances rather than fighting them. "Doesn't this worry you?" she asked. "Being trapped like this?" "Trapped's the wrong word," Silas replied, settling into his chair and reaching for his carving knife and a block of wood. "We're just guests in their territory for a few days. They'll move on when they're ready." It was during those days of confinement that Eleanor truly began to understand the depth of Silas's wilderness knowledge. He told her stories of wolf behavior, teaching her to read the pack's social dynamics by watching their interactions. The alpha male, he explained, was an old warrior with scars on his muzzle and a slight limp that spoke of countless battles. The female beside him was likely his mate, smaller but no less formidable, and the younger wolves showed them the kind of deference that spoke of established hierarchy. "Wolves mate for life," Silas observed, watching the pair work together to drive off a younger male who'd gotten too close to choice portions of the kill. "When one dies, the other rarely takes another mate. They understand loyalty in ways that put some humans to shame." Eleanor found herself drawn to the window repeatedly, fascinated despite her initial fear. The wolves moved with a kind of fluid grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to their environment. They were dangerous, yes, but they were also magnificent, living, embodiments of the mountain's wild spirit. On the second day of their vigil, disaster struck with the suddenness that characterized mountain emergencies. Eleanor was reading aloud from a book of Thoreau's essays when a sharp crack echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Both of them looked up in alarm, then toward the fireplace, where smoke was beginning to back up into the room instead of drawing properly up the chimney. "Chimney's blocked," Silas said, moving quickly to open windows and clear the smoke. "Probably ice build-up from the cold snap, or maybe debris from the wind." Eleanor watched him assess the situation with growing concern. Without the fireplace, they had no way to heat the cabin or cook their food, and with wolves controlling the area outside, Silas couldn't safely access the roof to clear whatever was blocking the chimney. "How long can we last without heat?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Not long," Silas admitted. "Temperature's still dropping, and this cabin wasn't built to hold heat without the fireplace. We've got maybe 12 hours before it gets dangerous." Eleanor felt panic rising in her chest, not just for herself, but for Silas. He could probably survive a night or two in the cold, but she knew her paralyzed legs made her much more vulnerable to hypothermia. She was going to be the weak link that got them both killed. But when she voiced these fears, Silas turned from the window where he'd been studying the wolves' positions and fixed her with a look of such calm confidence that her panic began to subside. "Lenore," he said firmly, "I've survived 15 winters in these mountains, 3 of them in this cabin before I got the fireplace working properly. We're not going to die today, and we're not going to die tonight, but I'm going to need your help." "What can I do?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Think," he said simply. "You've got the best educated mind in 100 miles. Help me figure out how to solve this problem with what we have available." For the next hour, they worked together like a team that had been planning military campaigns for years. Eleanor catalogued their resources while Silas assessed their options. They had blankets, extra clothing, oil lamps for light and limited warmth, and enough food for several days. What they didn't have was a safe way to reach the roof or to clear the chimney from inside. "What about the stovepipe?" Eleanor asked, studying the small cooking stove in the corner. "Could we disconnect it from the main chimney and run it out through a window?" Silas paused in his inventory, looking at her with the kind of respect usually reserved for brilliant tactical insights. "That might work. Stove doesn't draw as much as the fireplace, but it would give us heat and a way to cook. Problem is, I'd have to go outside to set it up properly." They both looked toward the window, where the wolf pack was still maintaining its vigil around the elk carcass. The alpha male seemed to sense their attention and turned his yellow gaze toward the cabin, his intelligence unmistakable. "I have an idea," Eleanor said slowly. "What if we don't try to avoid them? What if we work with them instead?" Silas raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to explain. "You said wolves are intelligent, that they understand territory and respect. What if you approach them directly, not as a threat but as someone requesting passage? Show them you're not challenging their claim to the kill, just asking for safe passage to do necessary work." It was a crazy idea by any conventional measure, but as Eleanor explained her reasoning, based on her observations of the pack's behavior and Silas's own teachings about wolf psychology, it began to make sense. Wolves respected confidence and direct communication. They responded to body language and intent more than to fear or aggression. "It's dangerous," Silas said finally. "If I read them wrong, then we try something else," Eleanor finished. "But if you read them right, we solve our problem and maybe learn something about living peacefully with the mountain's other residents." Silas looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes holding an expression she was learning to recognize, the look of a man discovering that his partner was even more remarkable than he'd initially realized. "All right," he said quietly. "We try it your way." The braided leather rope Silas had been working on for weeks became their lifeline, literally, strong enough to support his weight, long enough to allow him to work safely, even if the wolves changed their minds about his presence. Eleanor helped him prepare by organizing tools and supplies, making sure everything was within easy reach once he began the delicate work of redirecting the stovepipe. When Silas finally stepped out of the cabin, moving with slow, deliberate confidence, Eleanor held her breath. The wolves looked up from their feeding, alert but not immediately aggressive. The alpha male rose to his feet, studying this human who approached without fear or challenge. For a moment that seemed to last forever, man and wolf regarded each other across 20 feet of snow-covered ground. Then, incredibly, the alpha turned away, not in dismissal, but in the kind of acknowledgement that one intelligent predator gives to another. The message was clear. "You may pass, but don't interfere with our business." Silas worked with methodical efficiency, redirecting the stovepipe through the cabin's side window and securing it with improvised supports. The wolves watched but didn't interfere, maintaining their positions around the kill, but allowing him the space he needed to complete his work. Within 2 hours, they had heat again. The small cooking stove glowed cheerfully, warming the cabin and providing a way to prepare hot meals. Eleanor had never been so grateful for simple warmth, but more than that, she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her idea had worked, that she'd contributed something essential to their survival. That evening, as they sat close to the stove and listened to the wolves calling to each other in the darkness beyond their windows, Silas reached over and took her hand. "What you did today," he said quietly, "the way you thought through the problem and came up with a solution, that was remarkable. I couldn't have managed it without you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his words. For months after her accident, she'd felt useless, a burden on everyone around her. But here, in this remote cabin with wolves as their neighbors and winter as their adversary, she'd proven to herself and to Silas that she had value beyond just being cared for. "We make a good team," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "We do," Silas agreed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "A very good team." Outside, the wolves settled in for another night, their presence no longer a threat, but simply another element of the mountain's complex ecosystem. And inside the cabin, two people who'd been brought together by cruelty discovered that some partnerships are forged in fire. Not the fire of passion alone, but the fire of shared challenges overcome together. The wolves departed 3 days later, melting back into the high country as silently as they'd arrived. Silas found their tracks leading up toward the distant peaks, following ancient paths that predated human presence in the mountains by thousands of years. The elk carcass remained, picked clean and already being claimed by smaller scavengers, but the immediate crisis had passed. With the fireplace repaired and their normal routine restored, Eleanor expected things to return to the comfortable pattern they'd established. Instead, she found herself increasingly aware of subtleties that had been easier to ignore during the urgency of their shared emergency. The way Silas's hands lingered when he helped her into her chair, the moments when their eyes met and held just a beat longer than necessary, the careful distance he maintained, as if he were fighting some internal battle about propriety and desire. January brought the deepest cold of the winter. Temperatures that made the cabin's walls crack and settle with sounds like distant gunshots. It was during these bitter nights that Eleanor began working on her star chart, a project born from their shared wonder at the crystalline clarity of the mountain sky. With no city lights to dim their brilliance, the constellations blazed with intensity that took her breath away. "I never knew there were so many stars," she said one evening, working by lamplight to map the patterns she'd observed through the cabin's window. "Clear air and high altitude," Silas explained, watching her careful work with obvious admiration. "Sky looks different up here than anywhere else. Indians say each star is a campfire built by ancestors who've gone ahead to scout the trail." Eleanor paused in her drawing, struck by the poetry of the image. "That's beautiful. Do you believe it?" "I believe there's truth in most things people hold sacred," Silas replied carefully. "Maybe not literal truth, but the kind that speaks to what matters most." The star chart grew over many evenings, Eleanor's precise hand mapping constellations and noting the subtle movements that marked winter's progression towards spring. But it was more than just an astronomical exercise. It was becoming a record of their shared time, each night's observations linked to conversations and moments that were building into something precious and complex. "You have an artist's eye," Silas observed one evening, studying her latest additions to the chart, "where you capture not just where the stars are, but how they relate to each other. That takes real vision." Eleanor felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Compliments on her intelligence or her courage were one thing, but this recognition of creative ability touched something deeper. "I used to paint before the accident, landscapes mostly. I thought that part of my life was over." "Why?" The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of assumptions Eleanor hadn't even realized she was making. "I can't travel to find subjects anymore. Can't set up an easel in meadows or by streams. Who says art has to happen in meadows?" Silas interrupted gently. "Look what you've created just sitting by our window. Stars, weather patterns, the way light changes on the peaks throughout the day. Beauty doesn't require traveling to find it. Sometimes it requires staying still long, enough to really see what's already there." His words hit her with the force of revelation. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost that she'd failed to recognize what she'd gained. A different perspective, a deeper attention to detail, the ability to find extraordinary beauty in ordinary moments. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind sing through the eaves and thinking about vision, not just the physical ability to see, but the deeper capacity to perceive meaning and beauty in unexpected places. Silas had been teaching her this, without either of them realizing it, showing her through his own example how to find richness in simplicity. The realization brought with it another understanding that was more difficult to acknowledge. She was falling in love with him. Not the desperate gratitude of someone rescued from a terrible situation, but the deep, considered love of a woman who'd discovered a man worth loving. Silas McGraw, with his quiet strength, his unexpected depths, his ability to see beauty in broken things, had become essential to her happiness in ways that had nothing to do with shelter or protection. But acknowledging her feelings brought its own complications. What could she offer a man like Silas? He'd built a life of independence and self-sufficiency in these mountains. She was still dependent on his care for basic mobility, still limited, in ways that would always require accommodation. The townspeople's cruel joke echoed in her memory. What use was a paralyzed woman to a mountain man? These doubts came to a head during a conversation that began innocuously enough. Eleanor had been reading aloud from her journal, sharing observations about the way snow crystals formed different patterns depending on temperature and humidity. Silas listened with the focused attention he gave to all forms of knowledge, occasionally asking questions that showed he was thinking deeply about what she'd learned. "You see things most people miss," he said when she finished. "Got a way of finding patterns in what looks like chaos." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, then found herself adding, though I sometimes wonder what use such observations really are. It's not as if I can contribute anything practical to our life here." Silas looked up sharply from the leather he'd been working. "What do you mean by that?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, realizing she'd voiced something she'd meant to. "Keep private. I mean, well, look at what you do every day. Hunting, trapping, mining, maintaining everything that keeps us alive. And what do? I sit by the window and make pretty drawings of stars." "Eleanor," Silas said, his voice carrying a note of something between surprise and hurt, "do you truly believe that's all you contribute?" "What else?" she asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I can't help with the trap lines. Or the mining. I can't even cook a proper meal without help. I'm exactly what those townspeople said I was, a burden dressed up as something else." Silas set down his work and moved to kneel beside her chair, his grey eyes intense with an emotion she couldn't quite read. "Eleanor, look at me," she forced herself to meet his gaze, though it cost her considerable effort. "Do you remember that first week you were here?" he asked quietly. "When you organized my books and set up that system for finding things? I'd been hunting through those shelves for 15 years, but you saw patterns I'd never noticed, made everything accessible in ways I hadn't thought possible. That's just organizing." "And the accounts?" he continued, not letting her dismiss his words. "The correspondence you've helped me with, the way you've turned my scattered records into something that actually makes sense. That's not just organizing, Eleanor. That's bringing order to chaos, making the complex simple." He paused, running one hand through his graying hair. "But more than that, do you think I haven't noticed how this place has changed since you've been here? The music in the evenings, the conversations that make me think about things in new ways, the simple fact that I look forward to coming home instead of just enduring another day of solitude." Eleanor felt tears threaten. But Silas wasn't finished. "That business with the wolves," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Your idea to approach them directly instead of trying to avoid them. That saved our lives, Eleanor. Not my wilderness skills or my rifle, but your ability to see a situation clearly and find a solution no one else would have thought of." "But I can't," Eleanor began. "Can't what? Can't walk? Can't do everything exactly the way other people do it?" Silas's voice was gentle but firm. "Eleanor, I've lived alone in these mountains for 15 years. I know what useful looks like, and I know what burden looks like. You're not a burden. You're a partner. The best partner I could have hoped for." The tears came then, despite Eleanor's efforts to hold them back. Years of feeling useless, of believing herself diminished by her limitations, began to dissolve under the steady certainty in Silas's voice. "I'm sorry," she said through her tears. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for doubting yourself," Silas said softly. "World's been telling you lies about your worth for so long, it's no wonder you started believing them. But I need you to understand something, Eleanor. What we have here, this partnership we've built, it works because of who you are, not despite your limitations." He reached out hesitantly, as if asking permission, then gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. The touch was so tender, so careful, that Eleanor felt something shift deep in her chest. "The townspeople who brought you to me thought they were playing a joke," Silas continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but they gave me the greatest gift I've ever received. They gave me you." The words hung between them, electric with possibility and confession. Eleanor searched his face, seeing her own feelings reflected in his grey eyes, love, longing, and the careful hope of someone who'd learned not to take happiness for granted. "Silas," she said softly, his name carrying all the emotions she didn't know how to voice. "I know this complicates things," he said quickly, as if afraid she might pull away. "I know I'm older than you, that I'm not much to look at, that this life isn't what you were raised for." Eleanor silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "Hush," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you? Silas nodded, not trusting his voice. "I see a man who builds beauty as well as useful things," she said, echoing his earlier words about his father's philosophy. "A man who plays music to chase away the loneliness, who sees strength where others see weakness, who's patient enough to teach a city woman how to read the language of mountains." She traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers, marveling at the permission she felt to touch him, to be close to him, in ways she'd only dreamed of. "I see the kindest man I've ever known," she continued, "and the strongest, though not in the way most people measure strength. I see someone who's made me remember who I am beneath all the things that have happened to me." Silas caught her hand in his, pressing her palm against his cheek. "Eleanor, I love you," he said simply. "I know it's complicated. I know there are challenges." "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling like coming home. "I think I have almost since that first day, when you looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem to be solved." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative at first, then deeper as they both acknowledged what had been building between them for months. It tasted of hope and home, and the kind of love that grows from truly knowing another person. When they finally separated, Silas rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "Now we figure out how to build a life together," Silas replied. "A real life, not just surviving the winter, but planning for all the winters to come." Outside, the stars Eleanor had been mapping continued their ancient dance across the mountain sky, faithful witnesses to moments of transformation. Inside the cabin, two people who'd found each other through cruelty's unexpected gift began to plan a future that neither of them had dared to dream possible. The star chart lay forgotten on the table beside them, its careful notations a record of the nights when love had grown quietly in the spaces between constellation and conversation, between question and answer, between what was lost and what was found. March arrived with the promise of spring hidden. Beneath winter's final fury, the snow began to soften during the day, forming rivulets that spoke of eventual thaw. But the nights remained bitter enough to freeze those same streams into treacherous sheets of ice. It was during one of these deceptive early spring days that their world changed forever. Eleanor was working on correspondence for Silas's mining claims when the sound of horses' hooves echoed up from the lower trail, a sound so unexpected after months of winter isolation that she almost didn't recognize it. Silas looked up from sharpening his tools, his expression immediately alert. "Someone's coming," he said, moving to the window with the fluid caution that marked all his movements. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving slow on the ice. Eleanor felt a flutter of unease. In all the months she'd been at the cabin, no one had visited. Silas's isolation was so complete, so deliberately chosen, that the arrival of strangers could only mean trouble of some kind. The rider who appeared first around the bend in the trail was clearly a townsman, his clothes too fine for mountain travel, his seat in the saddle speaking of someone more accustomed to city streets than wilderness paths. Behind him rode 2 others, and Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the type. Hard men with careful eyes and hands that rested too easily on their weapons. "Marshal Henley," Silas said, recognizing the lead rider. "From Leadville. Haven't seen him in these parts for years." The marshal dismounted near the cabin, his movements careful on the icy ground. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent dealing with other people's troubles. When he knocked on the cabin door, his manner was polite but businesslike. "Silas McGraw," he called out. "Marshal Henley, Territorial Authority. Need to have a word with you, if you don't mind." Silas opened the door, his expression neutral, but wary. "Marshal, what brings you up the mountain in weather like this?" Henley stepped inside, removing his hat and nodding respectfully to Eleanor. "Ma'am, sorry to disturb your household, but I'm afraid I have some questions that need answering." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, official-looking, with the weight and appearance of a legal document. This is about Miss Eleanor Whitmore. Understand she's been staying with you since last fall? Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. Official papers about her could only mean one thing. Someone was trying to claim her, to drag her back into the world of legal guardianship and institutional care that she'd escaped. What kind of questions? Silas asked, his voice. He carefully controlled. Marshal Henley unfolded the paper, revealing a wanted poster that made Eleanor's blood run cold. But it wasn't her face on the poster. It was an image of a man she recognized with sickening clarity. Marcus Whitmore, her cousin, the distant relative who'd been managing her inheritance since her parents' death. Man named Marcus Whitmore has filed charges, Henley explained. Claims his cousin Eleanor was kidnapped from Cedar Ridge, taken against her will by persons unknown. Says she was mentally incompetent due to her injuries, couldn't have consented to leaving with anyone. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. That's not true, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I chose to come here. No one forced me to do anything. Henley looked at her with the kind of professional sympathy that police officers develop for victims they believe can't help themselves. Ma'am, I understand this might be confusing, but your cousin has legal guardianship over you. Says you've been missing for months, that he's been worried sick. Legal guardianship, Eleanor repeated, the words hitting her like physical blows. I never agreed to any such thing. I'm 26 years old, Marshal. I'm not a child or an invalid, according to the documents I have, Henley said gently. Your cousin was granted guardianship after the accident that left you disabled. Court in Chicago declared you unable to manage your own affairs due to diminished mental capacity resulting from your injuries. The lies came crashing down on Eleanor like an avalanche. Marcus had never mentioned guardianship papers during his infrequent visits to Cedar Ridge. He'd simply presented himself as a caring relative helping to manage her inheritance, which, she now realized, had been systematically disappearing under his management. Marshal, Silas said, his voice carrying dangerous undertones, Miss Eleanor is as mentally capable as anyone I've ever met, more so than most. If someone's convinced you otherwise, they've lied to you. Henley glanced between them, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Mr. McGraw, I understand you've grown attached to the young lady, but the law is clear. A person under legal guardianship can't simply leave with someone, even if they believe they want to. Then the law is wrong, Silas said flatly. Maybe so, Henley acknowledged, but it's still the law. I have a warrant for Miss Whitmore's return to her legal guardian, and another for the arrest of anyone who's kept her from him. Eleanor felt panic rising in her chest, but underneath the fear was a growing fury that burned hotter than anything she'd ever experienced. She'd been betrayed, manipulated, and stolen from, not by strangers, but by family who'd used her disability as an excuse to treat her like property. Marshal Henley, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I need to tell you something about my dear cousin Marcus. She reached into her skirt pocket and withdrew her mother's letter, the one piece of correspondence she'd kept from her old life. But hidden behind it was something else. Something she'd forgotten she even possessed. A bank draft from Chicago, dated just 2 weeks before she'd left the city for what Marcus had told her was a brief visit to Cedar Ridge. This, Eleanor said, holding up the draft, is a withdrawal authorization for $5,000 from my trust fund. My signature is on it, but I never signed it. I never authorized any such withdrawal. Marshal Henley took the document, studying it carefully. Eleanor watched his expression change as he examined the obvious forgery. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, if Marcus Whitmore is so concerned about my welfare, why did he never once visit Cedar Ridge during the months I was there? Why did he never inquire about my living arrangements or my care? And why, she asked, her voice rising with righteous anger, did he wait until spring to report me missing? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Marshal Henley looked increasingly uncomfortable as the implications sank in. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "these are serious allegations you're making. They're serious crimes he's committed." Eleanor shot back. "Fraud, forgery, theft, and using fabricated guardianship papers to cover his tracks." Silas stepped forward, his presence radiating the kind of quiet menace that came from years of military training. "Marshal, how exactly did Mr. Whitmore know where to find Miss Eleanor? She never told anyone in Cedar Ridge where she was going, and I haven't been to town since last fall." Henley frowned, consulting his papers. "He said he'd hired investigators to track her down, claimed they'd followed. Rumors about a mountain man taking a disabled woman. Expensive investigation for a man who's supposedly so concerned about his cousin's welfare," Silas observed. "Might be worth asking how he could afford private investigators when he's supposedly managing a trust fund that's been hemorrhaging money." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for Silas's quick thinking, but she wasn't finished. "Marshal Henley, I want you to look at something else." She maneuvered her wheelchair to the table where she'd been working on Silas's correspondence, pulling out a ledger she'd been keeping of her own financial records. "These are copies of statements from my trust fund, going back 3 years. Notice how the balance has dropped from $30,000 to less than $5,000 during the time Marcus has been my supposed guardian." Henley studied the figures, his frown deepening. "That's a significant decrease for someone who's supposedly unable to manage her own affairs," Eleanor said pointedly. "I seem to have maintained remarkably detailed financial records." The marshal looked up at her with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not an invalid to be pitied, but a sharp-minded woman who'd been systematically victimized by someone who should have protected her. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "are you saying your cousin has been stealing from your inheritance?" "I'm saying Marcus Whitmore has been embezzling from my trust fund, forged my signature on withdrawal authorizations, and fabricated guardianship papers to cover his crimes." Eleanor replied with crystal clarity. "And when I disappeared from his control, he panicked and concocted this story about kidnapping to force my return before anyone could discover what he'd done." One of the hard-faced men who'd ridden with the marshal shifted uncomfortably in his saddle outside. Through the window, Eleanor could see him exchange glances with his partner, the kind of look that suggested they knew more about this situation than they'd initially let on. "Marshal," Silas said quietly, "might want to ask those men you brought with you who's paying their wages, because they don't look like deputy marshals to me." Henley turned toward the window, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Jennings? Cartwright? Come in here a minute." The 2 men approached reluctantly, their posture suggesting they'd rather be anywhere else. Up close, Eleanor could see they were professional gunmen, the kind of men who solved problems with violence rather than law. These men were hired by Mr. Whitmore to assist in the recovery of his cousin, Henley explained, though his voice carried new uncertainty. "Funny thing about that," Silas said, moving to position himself between Eleanor and the gunman. "Professional bounty hunters don't usually work for private citizens unless there's serious money involved, more than most people would spend on a family member they're worried about." Eleanor felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. "He's not trying to rescue me, Marshal. He's trying to silence me. Once I'm back under his guardianship, who's going to believe anything I say about his embezzlement? Who's going to investigate the finances of a mentally incompetent woman who makes wild accusations against her devoted cousin?" The truth of it was written in the gunmen's faces, in their obvious discomfort with a situation that wasn't going according to plan. They'd expected to collect a helpless invalid, not face down a mountain man who clearly knew how to handle himself, and a woman whose intelligence was obviously intact. "Marshal Henley," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found her strength again, "I formally request protection from Marcus Whitmore and his hired men. I have evidence of multiple felonies, and I believe my life is in danger." Henley looked from Eleanor to Silas to the uncomfortable gunman, clearly realizing he'd walked into a situation far more complex than a simple guardianship dispute. Mr. McGraw, he said finally, you mentioned military service. What unit? 3rd Colorado Volunteers, Silas replied. Served under Chivington before I knew what kind of man he was. Later transferred to regular army, ended the war as a sergeant with the 5th Infantry. Henley nodded slowly. Military service meant something to men like him, carried implications of honor and trustworthiness that no amount of money could purchase. And, Miss Whitmore, he continued, these financial records you've shown me, you prepared these yourself. Every entry, Eleanor confirmed, along with correspondence, mining claims, paperwork, and various other documents requiring mathematical precision and legal understanding. Not exactly the work of someone with diminished mental capacity. The Marshal was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence Eleanor had presented and clearly weighing his options. Finally, he turned toward the gunman. Jennings, Cartwright. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This doesn't look like a kidnapping case anymore. Looks more like a fraud investigation. You boys might want to ride back to whoever sent you and tell them the situation has changed. The gunmen exchanged glances, clearly unhappy with this development. Mr. Whitmore paid us to bring the woman back, one of them said. Contract says dead or alive if she resists. The casual mention of violence made Eleanor's blood freeze, but Silas stepped forward with the kind of controlled menace that spoke of a man who'd killed before and would again, if necessary. Then your contract just became void, he said quietly, because this woman is under the protection of a territorial marshal and an honorably discharged United States soldier. You want to try collecting on that bounty? You'll have to go through both of us. Marshal Henley's hand was now resting openly on his pistol. I'd suggest you gentlemen reconsider your employment arrangements, he said. Threatening a woman under official protection tends to be a career-limiting decision. The standoff lasted several heartbeats, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Then the gunmen backed down, recognizing they were outnumbered and outgunned by men who wouldn't hesitate to use force if necessary. This ain't over, one of them said as they mounted their horses. Yes, it is, Silas replied calmly. It's over because the woman you came for doesn't exist. Eleanor Whitmore is a free citizen of the territory of Colorado, and she's made her choice about where she wants to live and with whom. Anyone who has a problem with that choice is welcome to discuss it with me personally. As the gunman rode away, Marshal Henley turned back to Eleanor and Silas. Miss Whitmore, I'm going to need you to come to Leadville and make a formal statement about these fraud allegations. Can't arrest a man in Chicago based on what I've seen here, but I can start the process. She'll come, Silas said firmly, but not alone, and not until those hired guns are long gone and we're sure it's safe. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for his protectiveness, but also a deep satisfaction at finally being able to fight back against the man who'd victimized her. The scared, helpless woman who'd been brought to Cedar Ridge as a cruel joke was gone, replaced by someone who'd found her strength in the most unexpected place. As Marshal Henley prepared to leave, promising to return in a week with proper escorts for their journey to Leadville, Eleanor realized that everything had changed again. The peaceful winter cocoon she'd shared with Silas was about to be broken open, forcing them into a larger world that held both justice and danger. But she was no longer afraid. The mountains had taught her that some challenges had to be faced directly, and the man beside her had taught her that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as rescuer and victim, but as partners in every sense of the word. The week that followed Marshal Henley's visit passed with the kind of tense preparation that reminded Silas of the hours before battle. Every routine task, checking trap lines, maintaining equipment, organizing supplies, carried an undercurrent of urgency. The knowledge that their peaceful mountain existence was about to be disrupted by forces beyond their control. Eleanor threw herself into preparation with an intensity that both impressed and worried Silas. She organized her financial evidence with methodical precision, creating copies of every document and preparing statements that detailed Marcus's theft with devastating clarity. But underneath her focused efficiency, he could sense the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "You don't have to do this," he told her one evening as she worked by lamplight, her handwriting precise despite the late hour. "Could always disappear deeper into the mountains, find a place where no law can reach us." Eleanor looked up from her work, her green eyes holding a determination that reminded him of tempered steel. "I won't spend the rest of my life running from a man who stole from me and lied about me. Besides," she added with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "where would we go that would be better than here?" It was during their preparations that Silas made a decision that surprised even him. He retrieved a small wooden box from beneath loose floorboards in the corner of the cabin, a hiding place Eleanor had never suspected. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a military medal he'd never shown to anyone. The Medal of Honor was tarnished. With age but still recognizable, its ribbon faded but intact. Eleanor stared at it in amazement as Silas held it in his weathered hands. "Battle of Glorieta Pass," he said quietly. "Stopped a Confederate charge that would have broken our line. Lost a lot of good men that day, but we held the field." "Why? Didn't you ever tell me?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft with wonder. Silas shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Medals don't make the man, actions do. But I figure if we're going into a legal fight, might help to have people understand I'm not just some wild mountain hermit who steals women." The medal represented more than military recognition. It was proof of character, of service to country and cause. In a world where Eleanor's word might be dismissed as the ravings of an unstable woman, Silas's military record would carry weight that no amount of Marcus's money could purchase. But even as they prepared for their journey to Leadville, both of them sensed that the real confrontation wouldn't wait for legal proceedings. Men like Marcus Whitmore didn't surrender their schemes to courtroom justice. They fought dirty, using whatever weapons came to hand. The first sign of trouble came on Thursday morning, when Silas discovered tracks around the cabin's perimeter. Bootprints in the soft snow, too large to belong to Eleanor and too fresh to be his own. Someone had been watching them, studying their routines and defenses. "How many?" Eleanor asked when he told her about the tracks. "At least 2, maybe 3, Silas replied, checking the loads in his rifle. "Professional work. They stayed hidden. Didn't disturb anything, just observed." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. "Marcus's men, or new ones he hired after Henley sent the first pair packing," Silas confirmed grimly. "Either way, they're scouting us for something." That afternoon brought the answer. A rider approached openly up the main trail, not the stealthy reconnaissance of the morning, but a deliberate announcement of presence. The man who dismounted near their cabin was well-dressed, prosperous-looking, with the kind of soft features that spoke of indoor work and regular meals. Marcus Whitmore had come to collect his property personally. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to manipulation. "My dear cousin, thank God I found you safe. I've been so worried." Silas opened the cabin door, positioning himself where he could protect Eleanor while keeping his rifle within easy reach. Marcus's smile faltered when he saw the mountain man's cold grey eyes. "Mr. McGraw, I presume," Marcus said, recovering his composure with practiced ease. "I'm Marcus Whitmore, Eleanor's cousin and legal guardian. I've come to bring her home." "She is home," Silas replied simply. Marcus's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his veneer of civilized concern. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. Eleanor is my responsibility, has been since the tragic accident that left her impaired." Eleanor wheeled herself into view, her face set with cold fury. "Hello, Marcus. Surprised to see me looking so healthy and competent?" "Eleanor, my dear," Marcus said, his tone shifting to the condescending gentleness he might use with a child. "I know this man has filled your head with ideas, but you're not well enough to make these kinds of decisions. That's why the court appointed me as your guardian, to protect you from exactly this kind of situation." "You mean to protect yourself from discovery of your embezzlement?" Eleanor shot back. "I have records, Marcus, bank drafts with forged signatures, withdrawal authorizations I never signed, investment losses that somehow coincided with improvements to your own property in Chicago." Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the surface. "You're confused, dear. The injuries from the accident affected your memory, your ability to think clearly. That's what the doctors said when they recommended guardianship." "Which doctors?" Eleanor demanded. "Because I never saw any physicians who recommended such a thing. In fact, I'd like to see the court documents that granted you guardianship, since I was never notified of any such proceedings." "The documents are all in order," Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "What matters now is getting you the care you need. This rustic lifestyle obviously isn't suitable for someone in your condition." Silas stepped forward, his presence radiating barely controlled menace. "Mr. Whitmore, your cousin has made it clear she doesn't wish to go with you. I'd suggest you respect her decision, and I'd suggest you understand the serious legal consequences of interfering." "With a lawful guardianship," Marcus replied, some of his smooth confidence returning. "Kidnapping charges, harboring an incompetent person, fraud, the penalties are quite severe." "So are the penalties for embezzlement and forgery," Eleanor said coldly. "Marshal Henley seemed very interested in those bank drafts when I showed them to him." Marcus's composure cracked slightly. "Marshal Henley, you've involved territorial law in family matters." "I've reported crimes to the appropriate authorities," Eleanor corrected, "though I suppose from your perspective, it might look like family business." The standoff continued for several minutes, Marcus alternating between concerned relative and legal authority, Eleanor and Silas presenting a united front of calm determination. But underneath the civilized conversation, tensions were building, toward something that couldn't be resolved with words. It was Marcus who broke first, his mask of genteel concern finally slipping entirely. "Eleanor, you're coming with me. Now. I've tried to be reasonable, but you're clearly not competent to make these decisions for yourself." He gestured toward the trees, and Eleanor's blood ran cold as armed men emerged from concealment. Not the 2 gunmen from before, but 4 new faces, harder men, the kind who solved problems with violence and didn't ask questions about consequences. "I came prepared for resistance," Marcus said, his voice now carrying open menace. "These gentlemen have instructions to use whatever force is necessary to ensure your safe return to civilization." Silas assessed the situation with the tactical mind that had served him through years of warfare. 4 armed men positioned to crossfire the cabin. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had advantages they didn't: knowledge of the terrain, prepared positions, and the desperate motivation of a man protecting what he loved most. "Eleanor," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the gunman, "remember what I taught you about the root cellar?" She nodded, understanding immediately. The cabin's storm shelter, accessible through a concealed trapdoor, was their emergency refuge. Stocked with supplies and defensible from multiple positions, it was their last resort if the situation turned violent. "Mr. Whitmore," Silas said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command, "you're making a mistake. Miss Eleanor is under the protection of territorial law, and any violence against her or her property will be met with appropriate force." "The only mistake," Marcus replied, "is thinking a backwoods nobody can interfere with legal proceedings. Eleanor is coming with me, and you're not going to stop it." He nodded to his men, and Eleanor saw hands move toward weapons. The moment of decision had arrived, the point where words gave way to action and peaceful resolution became impossible. But Silas McGraw had fought in too many battles to be intimidated by hired guns. His hand moved to the Medal of Honor in his pocket, not for luck, but for the reminder it carried of duty, honor, and the willingness to stand against impossible odds for what was right. "Eleanor," he said softly, "get to the cellar, now. I won't leave you. Go," he ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military command. "This is what I do. Trust me." As Eleanor maneuvered toward the concealed trapdoor, her heart hammering with fear for the man she loved, Silas McGraw prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. Not for territory or ideology this time, but for love, for justice, and for the right of a good woman to choose her own destiny. The mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of storm, but inside the cabin, the only storm that mattered was the one about to break between a corrupt man's greed and a soldier's determination to protect what he held most dear. The peaceful winter was over. The real fight was about to begin. The first shot shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass cascading across the floor like deadly rain. Silas had anticipated it, dropping to one knee behind the heavy oak table he'd overturned for cover. His return shot was immediate and precise, catching one of Marcus's hired guns in the shoulder and sending him spinning backward into the snow. "Eleanor, stay down," Silas shouted, levering another round into his rifle's chamber. From her position near the root cellar entrance, Eleanor could see the small mirror she'd positioned months ago to help her navigate the cabin's layout. Now it served a different purpose, reflecting the movements of the gunmen as they tried to establish better positions around the cabin. The angle showed her something Silas couldn't see from his position. One of the men was circling toward the back of the building. "Silas," she called out, "back window! Someone's coming around!" Her warning came just in time. Silas spun toward the rear of the cabin as the back door exploded inward, wooden splinters flying. But instead of the careful aim of a professional, the gunman who burst through was clearly rattled, his shots wild and panicked. Silas's responding shot was not wild at all. Outside, Marcus's voice rose above the gunfire, shrill with panic and rage. "Alive! I need her alive, you idiots! She's worthless to me dead!" The admission sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Marcus wasn't just trying to reclaim stolen property. He needed her alive to maintain his legal fiction, to continue the charade that would let him finish emptying her trust fund. But the small mirror that had warned her about the rear assault now showed her something else. A third gunman had broken away from the main attack and was positioning himself where he could see into the root cellar. If she tried to retreat to their planned refuge, she'd be trapped like a rabbit in a burrow. Instead of fleeing, Eleanor made a decision that would have terrified the helpless woman she'd been 6 months ago. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, using it to smash out the remaining glass from the front window. The mirror from her vanity table became her weapon, angled to catch the afternoon sun and direct its reflection straight into the eyes of the gunman trying to get a clear shot at Silas. The man cursed and stumbled, his shot going wide. It was the opening Silas needed, but even as one threat was neutralized, another was developing. Marcus himself had dismounted and was approaching the cabin, a small derringer in his hand and the desperate look of a man with nothing left to lose. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice cracking with strain, "this ends now. You're coming with me, or I'll claim you were killed in the crossfire. Either way, I get what I need." The cold calculation in his words chilled Eleanor to the bone. He was prepared to murder his own cousin rather than lose control of her inheritance. The concerned guardian act had been replaced by naked greed and desperation. From behind his overturned table, Silas assessed the tactical situation with grim efficiency. 2 gunmen down, 2 still active, plus Marcus himself. His ammunition was limited, and he couldn't maintain this defensive position indefinitely, but more critically, he couldn't protect Eleanor and fight effectively at the same time. That's when Eleanor made the decision that changed everything. "Marcus," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the battle-torn cabin. "You want to talk? Let's talk." She began maneuvering her wheelchair toward the front door, ignoring Silas's sharp protest. But instead of surrender, Eleanor was implementing a plan that would have impressed any military tactician. "Eleanor, don't," Silas began. "Trust me," she said quietly, echoing his earlier words to her. "This is what I do." As she appeared in the doorway, Eleanor held up the small mirror she'd been using to blind the gunman. But now it served a different purpose entirely. It reflected not sunlight, but the approaching figure of Marshal Henley and a company of territorial militia riding hard up the mountain trail. Marcus saw the reflection at the same moment Eleanor spoke. "You were right about one thing, Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "This does end now, but not the way you planned." The sound of approaching horses was unmistakable now. Marshal Henley had kept his word about returning with proper escort, but he'd arrived just in time to witness an attempted murder rather than conduct a peaceful interview. Marcus's face went white as he realized his situation had become hopeless. The surviving gunmen looked at each other, clearly calculating whether their pay was worth facing territorial militia in addition to the mountain man who'd already proven his deadly competence. "Throw down your weapons!" Henley's voice echoed across the clearing as the militia deployed around the cabin. "This area is under territorial authority." The surrender came quickly after that. The remaining gunmen, faced with overwhelming odds and the testimony of a Medal of Honor recipient, decided discretion was the better part of continued breathing. Marcus himself seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon, the desperate energy that had driven him to violence draining away as he faced the inevitable consequences of his schemes. But even in defeat, he couldn't resist one final attempt at manipulation. "Marshal," he called out, "this woman is mentally incompetent. She can't be held responsible for the lies she's telling about me. The mountain man has obviously influenced her." "Save it for the judge," Henley interrupted, dismounting near the cabin's damaged front porch. "We found the real guardianship documents in Chicago, the ones that show you forged the court signature and bribed a clerk to file false papers." Eleanor felt a surge of vindication mixed with relief. The law had finally caught up with Marcus's crimes, but more than that, it had vindicated her competence and her right to make her own decisions. As the militia secured the prisoners and began collecting evidence, Eleanor found herself face to face with the man who'd tried to destroy her life for money. Marcus looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his true nature. "Why?" she asked simply. "I trusted you. My parents trusted you." Marcus's answer, when it came, was devoid of the charm and manipulation he'd wielded so skillfully. "Because you were supposed to die in that accident," he said flatly. "The insurance money and the inheritance were supposed to be mine. When you survived, you became an expensive problem that needed managing." The casual admission of his hopes for her death hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but it also completed her understanding of just how thoroughly she'd been betrayed. Marcus hadn't just stolen her money, he'd stolen 3 years of her life, convinced her she was helpless and dependent when she was anything but. Silas appeared at her side, blood seeping from a shallow wound on his arm, but otherwise unharmed. His presence steadied her, reminding her of how far she'd come from the broken woman Marcus had tried to keep her believing she was. "It's over," Silas said quietly, his words addressed to both Eleanor and the larger situation. Eleanor looked around at the damaged cabin, at the militia loading prisoners, at the evidence of violence that had shattered their peaceful mountain sanctuary. But underneath the chaos, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the solid satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed. "Yes," she agreed, reaching for Silas's uninjured hand. "It's over." The aftermath of violence was always messier than the violence itself. As Marshal Henley's men secured the prisoners and began the grim work of dealing with the dead, Eleanor found herself staring at the wreckage of the home she'd come to love. Bullet holes pocked the walls, glass littered the floor, and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the mountain air. but it was the sight of Silas's blood on her hands as she helped bandage his wounded arm that finally broke through the numbness. She'd maintained during the confrontation. He'd been willing to die for her, had faced impossible odds without hesitation because she mattered more to him than his own safety. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice rougher than she intended. "Scratch," Silas replied, though the tight lines around his eyes suggested it was more than that. "Bullet grazed me when I was moving between positions. I've had worse shaving." Eleanor didn't believe him, but she recognized the stubborn independence that made him minimize his own pain. Instead of arguing, she focused on cleaning the wound with the methodical precision that had become second nature during their months together. Marshal Henley approached as she finished tying off the bandage, his expression grim but respectful. "Mr. McGraw, Miss Whitmore, I need statements from both of you about what happened here today. But first there's something you both should know." He pulled out a telegram, worn from handling. "This came through yesterday. Federal marshals in Chicago arrested 3 more men connected to your cousin's operation, Miss Whitmore. Appears he was running similar schemes on at least 4 other families with disabled or elderly relatives. You weren't his only victim." Eleanor felt sick at the thought of others suffering as she had, but also a fierce satisfaction that Marcus's crimes would be fully exposed. "Will they face justice?" "Full prosecution," Henley confirmed. "Your evidence was the key that broke the whole thing open. Without your detailed financial records and that forged bank draft, we might never have uncovered the scope of his operations." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. The very capability Marcus had tried to use against her, claiming she was too mentally impaired to manage her affairs, had provided the evidence that brought him down. Her intelligence and attention to detail, the qualities that made her a valuable partner to Silas, had also made her a formidable opponent when she finally chose to fight back. "What happens to my inheritance?" she asked. "What's left will be restored to your control," Henley said. "Won't be everything. He managed to spend or hide quite a bit, but enough for you to live comfortably if you're careful." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "Money's not what makes a life worth living," he said quietly, "but it's good to have choices." As the official business concluded and the prisoners were prepared for transport to Leadville, Eleanor found herself alone with Silas. In their damaged cabin, the silence between them was heavy, with unspoken questions about what came next. "We'll need to repair the windows before the next storm," Silas said, surveying the damage with practical eyes. "We?" Eleanor asked, though her heart already knew the answer. Silas looked at her with the same steady honesty that had marked their relationship from the beginning. "This is your home, Eleanor. Has been since the day you chose to stay. Bullet holes don't change that." She wheeled herself to the front window, looking out at the mountains that had become as essential to her happiness as the man who'd shown her their beauty. The peaks stood unchanged by the day's violence, eternal and patient, waiting for peace. To return to the valley below. "I have choices now," she said, echoing Henley's words. "I could go anywhere, do anything. The world's opened up again." "It has," Silas agreed, though something in his voice suggested he was bracing himself for whatever decision she might make. Eleanor turned to face him, this remarkable man who'd seen her worth when no one else could, who'd protected her without trying to control her, who'd given her the space to rediscover her own strength. "I choose this," she said simply. "I choose you, this cabin, these mountains. I choose the life we've built together." The relief in Silas's eyes was profound, though he tried to hide it behind his characteristic reserve. "Eleanor, you need to be sure. This isn't an easy life, even without people shooting at us. Winters are hard, supplies are uncertain, and the nearest neighbor is 30 miles away." "I know," Eleanor replied, moving her chair closer to him. "I've lived it for 6 months. Remember, I know exactly what I'm choosing." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the simple tool she'd fashioned during the gunfight, a wooden handle attached to a sharp metal point, crafted from a broken kitchen utensil and designed to be wielded from her wheelchair. It wasn't much to look at, but it had been effective enough to discourage one of Marcus's gunmen when diplomacy failed. "I'm not the helpless woman they brought you as a joke," she said, holding up her improvised weapon. "I'm not the victim Marcus tried to keep me believing I was. I'm someone who can stand beside you and hold my own when trouble comes calling." Silas took the makeshift weapon, examining it with professional interest. "Effective," he said approvingly. "Good balance, practical design. You've got an instinct for this." "I have an instinct for survival," Eleanor corrected, "and for protecting what matters to me." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the damaged doorframe. Marshal Henley stood outside, hat in hand and a peculiar expression on his weathered face. "Pardon the interruption," he said, "but there's one more piece of business we need to discuss." He stepped inside, carefully avoiding the broken glass, and withdrew an official-looking document from his coat. "This is a warrant for your arrest, Mr. McGraw." Eleanor felt her heart stop, but Henley continued before either of them could protest. "Warrant was issued based on Marcus Whitmore's complaint about kidnapping and harboring an incompetent person," he explained. "But given what we've learned today, I'm officially declaring the warrant invalid due to false information provided by the complainant." He tore the document in half, letting the pieces flutter to the cabin floor. "Far as territorial law is concerned, you're both free citizens who defended yourselves against attempted murder and robbery. No charges, no restrictions, no questions asked." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this final vindication, this official recognition that she was competent to make her own choices and that Silas was an honorable man who'd acted within his rights. "There is one more thing," Henley added, almost as an afterthought. "Territorial governor's been looking for men with military experience to help with some troubles we've been having with claim jumpers and road agents. Pays well, and the work would let you keep your home base here in the mountains." Silas considered this, glancing at Eleanor. "Appreciate the offer, Marshal, but I'm not looking to get back into the soldiering business." "Not soldiering," Henley clarified. "More like consulting, teaching other men how to handle themselves in difficult terrain, maybe helping with some of the more complex situations that require military thinking rather than just more guns." Eleanor saw the way Silas's expression shifted slightly, not with enthusiasm, but with the kind of thoughtful consideration he gave to any serious decision. She realized this could be important, not just for the income, but for giving Silas a way to use his hard-won experience for something constructive. "What would it involve?" she asked, surprising both men with her question. Henley looked at her with respect. "Mostly training and planning, ma'am. Maybe 2 weeks out of every month. Based out of Leadville, but with plenty of time to maintain your life here. And the territory could use someone with your skills too, if you're interested. We've got correspondence that needs organizing, record-keeping, that requires someone who can spot discrepancies, like you spotted your cousin's fraud." Eleanor felt a surge of excitement at the possibility. Work that would use her abilities, that would make her a contributor rather than just a beneficiary of Silas's protection. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd never thought to hope for. "We'll think about it," Silas said diplomatically, but Eleanor could see he was intrigued despite his caution. After Henley left with his prisoners and his promises to keep them informed about the legal proceedings, Eleanor and Silas found themselves truly alone for the first time since the confrontation began. The cabin felt different, not just because of the physical damage, but because something fundamental had changed in their relationship. They'd faced mortal danger together and emerged, not just alive but stronger. Eleanor had proven she could be more than a protected civilian, and Silas had demonstrated the depths of his commitment to their partnership. The careful courtesy that had marked their early interactions was gone, replaced by something deeper and more honest. "Eleanor," Silas said as they worked together to board up the broken windows, "there's something I need to say." She looked up from the glass she was sweeping, noting the serious tone in his voice. "When those men came for you today," he continued, "when I thought I might lose you, it made me realize I've been holding back, being careful, trying to be a gentleman, giving you space to make your own decisions about us. And, Eleanor prompted, though she thought she knew where this was leading. And life's too short for that kind of caution, Silas said simply. Eleanor Whitmore, I love you, not just as a partner or a friend, but as the woman I want to spend whatever time I have left with. I know there are complications. Know we come from different worlds, but Eleanor silenced him by reaching up from her chair to pull his head down for a kiss that was anything but careful or cautious. When they separated, both were breathing unsteadily. Silas McGraw, she said, her voice firm with certainty. I fell in love with you months ago. I was just waiting for you to catch up. The laughter that followed was rich and warm, echoing through the damaged cabin like a promise of healing and renewal. Outside, the mountains stood patient and eternal, witnesses to another chapter in the endless story of human resilience and the power of love to transform even the cruelest circumstances into something beautiful. As darkness fell over the valley, Eleanor and Silas worked side by side to make their home secure and comfortable again. The bullet holes would be patched, the broken windows replaced, the scars of violence healed by time and care. But the deeper changes, the growth, the strength, the love that had been tested and proven unbreakable, those would remain forever. The tchotchkes joke that had brought them together was long forgotten, transformed into something neither of them could have imagined when Eleanor first arrived at the cabin. They'd found not just love, but partnership, not just safety, but purpose, not just survival, but a life worth living together, whatever challenges the future might bring. 6 months later, the wedding rings carved from mountain stone caught the afternoon light streaming through the cabin's new windows. Eleanor turned, them on her finger as she worked at the desk Silas had built for her correspondence with the territorial government. Letters that carried weight and authority, the work of a woman whose intelligence was finally being recognized and valued. The cabin itself bore little resemblance to the austere bachelor quarters it had been when she first arrived. Books lined custom-built shelves. Her star charts decorated the walls alongside Silas's hunting trophies, and the space hummed with the comfortable energy of 2 lives fully integrated. The crude wooden wheelchair that had symbolized her limitations had been replaced by an elegant model crafted by a furniture maker in Denver, designed for both function and dignity. But it was the music that truly marked the transformation. Each evening, as the sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Silas would play his wooden flute while Eleanor hummed along, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to echo off the mountain walls. The songs were different now, not melancholy remembrances of what was lost, but celebrations of what had been found. Letter from Marshal Henley, Silas announced, returning from his weekly trip to the lower valley where mail was delivered. Trial concluded in Chicago. Marcus and his associates got 20 years hard labor, full restitution ordered for all victims. Eleanor nodded with satisfaction, though the news felt like the closing of a chapter rather than a surprise. Justice had taken its course, as she'd known it would once the truth came to light. What mattered more was the present, the life she and Silas had built together in the aftermath of that terrible confrontation. And something else, Silas continued, his grey eyes holding the hint of amusement that still made her pulse quicken. Letter from the governor's office. Seems they're impressed with your work organizing territorial records. They want to offer you a permanent position as senior administrative coordinator. Eleanor looked up from her own correspondence. A letter to a women's college back east, accepting their invitation to write about her experiences of recovery and adaptation after injury. The opportunities that had opened up still sometimes surprised her, but she'd learned to embrace possibility rather than fear it. Permanent position would mean spending more time in Denver, she observed. Would, Silas agreed. But it would also mean we could afford some improvements to this place. Maybe add a proper workshop, expand the library, get one of those new-fangled wood stoves that heats more efficiently. The we came naturally now, automatically. They'd moved beyond the careful negotiations of early partnership into the seamless cooperation of two people who'd learned to think of themselves as a unit. Eleanor's growing success in territorial administration complemented Silas's work training mountain guides and security personnel, their separate skills creating a household that was both prosperous and purposeful. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, setting aside her pen and maneuvering her chair to face him fully, "about something Mrs. Henderson said when we visited Cedar Ridge last month." Silas raised an eyebrow, waiting. Their visit to the town where their story began had been both cathartic and revealing, seeing how differently people treated Eleanor when she arrived as the successful wife of a respected man rather than the helpless burden they'd remembered. "She said it was remarkable how I'd overcome my limitations to build such a successful life," Eleanor continued, her tone holding the edge of irony that had developed when discussing other people's assumptions about disability, as if my limitations were something separate from me rather than just part of who I am. "And what did you tell her?" Silas asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "I told her I hadn't overcome anything," Eleanor replied firmly. "I'd simply learned to work with what I have instead of mourning what I don't have. Different isn't the same as limited, it's just different." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that would have been impossible to imagine during their first winter together, the laughter of children playing outside their cabin. Young Tom Bradley from Cedar Ridge had married and moved to the area, becoming their nearest neighbor and bringing with him the kind of community connections that transformed solitude from isolation into chosen privacy. Through the window, Eleanor could see Tom's two young daughters building snow forts with the engineering precision she'd taught them during their last visit. The girls treated her wheelchair as simply another interesting feature of their mountain neighbor, no more remarkable than Silas's skill with tools or the way their own mother could predict weather by watching cloud patterns. "They're going to want hot chocolate when they finish with those forts," Eleanor observed. "I'll put the kettle on," Silas replied, moving toward the kitchen area with the easy domesticity that marked their shared routines. As he prepared the hot chocolate, Eleanor returned to her letter to the women's college. She was trying to find words to express something that couldn't be easily explained, the way adversity had led not to diminishment, but to a kind of expansion, opening possibilities that might never have existed otherwise. "The cruel joke that brought us together," she wrote, "became the foundation of the most honest relationship either of us had ever known. When people expect nothing from you, you're free to discover what you're actually capable of. When someone sees your worth, despite what others consider flaws, you learn to see it yourself." She paused, looking around the cabin that had become so much more than shelter. Every object told the story of their partnership, his practical craftsmanship enhanced by her eye for beauty and organization, her intellectual pursuits supported by his deep knowledge of the natural world, their separate strengths woven together into something stronger than either could have achieved alone. The simple wedding rings they'd carved together were symbols of commitment, but more than that, they were symbols of choice. Eleanor had chosen this life not from desperation or lack of options, but from recognition that love and partnership came in many forms, not all of them conventional. "Finished," she announced, signing her name to the letter with a flourish. Silas looked up from the stove where milk was heating for hot chocolate. "What did you decide to tell them?" "The truth," Eleanor said simply, "that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the doorway to the best things. That cruel people can accidentally create something beautiful if the right people are involved. That love isn't about perfection. It's about seeing clearly and choosing to stay." She maneuvered her chair to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become her home, the peaks that had witnessed her transformation from victim to partner, from burden to asset, from someone who saw only limitations to someone who created possibilities. And she continued, her voice soft with contentment, that sometimes God answers prayers we didn't even know we were praying. Silas came to stand beside her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as they watched the children play in the snow. The gesture was casual, comfortable, carrying the weight of shared experience and mutual understanding. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Eleanor reached up to cover his hand with hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the warmth that spoke of endless tenderness. "Only that it took so long to get here," she replied. "But then again, maybe we both needed to become the people we were meant to be before we could recognize what we had." Outside, the mountains stood eternal and patient, their beauty unmarked by human struggles and aspirations. But inside the cabin, two people who'd been brought together by cruelty had created something precious and lasting. A partnership built on respect, strengthened by adversity, and sustained by the daily choice to see each other clearly and love what they saw. The wooden flute sat ready by Silas's chair, waiting for evening music. Eleanor's star charts marked the progression of seasons and the reliability of celestial patterns. And somewhere in Cedar Ridge, people still occasionally told the story of the mountain man and the paralyzed woman, though they never quite understood how their cruel joke had become the foundation of something beautiful. As the sun set behind the peaks and the children's laughter echoed across the valley, Eleanor and Silas began their evening routine. Music and warmth and the quiet satisfaction of two people who'd found their way home to each other against impossible odds. Sometimes the cruelest moments in life really do become the doorway to our greatest blessings. Sometimes what others see as broken, God sees as perfectly whole. And sometimes a joke meant to cause pain becomes instead the beginning of the most beautiful love story ever told.